And then if you don't actually mind stopping sharing on your screen, and I'll start the...
Oh, I didn't know I was.
Yeah, so sorry.
It doesn't say I'm sharing. Am I still sharing?
Yes.
Okay, so it does not say that.
Okay.
Can you take it away from me?
Yes.
Stop video maybe? Okay. Oh no.
Oops.
Welcome to Denver Startup Week. I'm really excited to see how the community comes together to create something new and powerful out of all the challenges we're facing today. We're able to bring Denver Startup Week to this community thanks to our sponsors. Join me in thanking our 2020 Denver Startup Week sponsors, our title sponsors, Downtown Denver Partnership, JP Morgan Chase, Prologis, and Zero. Our track sponsors who have made all the great content you're hearing today possible. Battery 621 and the Public Works, Capital One Cafe, Colorado Lending Source, Friday Health, Quizlet, Exactly, Zayo, and Zestful. Our headline event sponsors are bringing the excitement this week. Thank you to Wix, Kenzen, MAPR Agency, City and HR, Kickstart Fund, Promontory Mortgage, Molson Coors, and Comcast. Finally, thank you to our partner and member sponsors listed on the screen. Please say thank you to these companies as you enjoy our virtual Denver Startup Week. And don't forget to use hashtag #DenStartupWeek to share your experience and moments of inspiration on social media.
Hey everybody, it's Ben Higgins here. I am a proud Denver resident. I have been for the last 8 years and I love Denver. I've called it home for the last 8 years because I love the people, I love the creativity, I love the activity, and I love where the city is going. But I also get the privilege of welcoming all of you to Denver Startup Week's product track session brought to you by the one and only Capital One. As a small business owner myself, I have a few restaurants and a few businesses there in Denver, actually. I'm proud to partner with Capital One to celebrate all things entrepreneurship, especially during these unprecedented times. So, for all of you out there, enjoy this session. And I look forward to connecting with all of you.
Hey everyone, welcome to Denver Startup Week. We are just so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in today. My name is Kylie and I am the Product Track Co-Chair and a member of the Denver Startup Week Organizing Committee. Again, thank you so much for joining us for our first ever virtual Denver Startup Week. Here at Denver Startup Week, we strive to make sure that all of our sessions are a safe space where attendees can connect, learn, and grow. So like our video said, please just take a minute with me and help recognize our Denver Startup Week sponsors, especially our product track sponsor, Capital One. We just want to thank them because they are a huge support in helping us keep Denver Startup Week free and accessible for all. Like I said, we are thrilled that you joined us today for this session on feature debt and how it relates to tech debt. We are just excited to hear from our speaker, David. I know he has a lot of wisdom to share with us today. So be sure to add your Q&A into the chat. And after David goes through his presentation, he can get to that. And really, truly, thanks for joining. Enjoy today. And David, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much. I want to, in addition to thanking the sponsors, really thank the organizers for this event. There are so many logistics that go into this. I've been on some sessions already and I can just and been working with them all last week. I just know how much work goes into this. So I really appreciate that. I've been coming to Denver Startup for years. I'm a member of the Denver product community, and so I'm just so excited to be part of it this year. Yesterday, I went to a great session on the elusive topic of finding product market fit, and I really just hope that I can deliver the same. So a couple of things before we get into it. As they mentioned, please do enter questions in the Q&A portion specifically. I'll be monitoring that kind of as we go. I'll try to take pauses in between sections to be able to answer questions. I want to try to make this as interactive of a conversation as possible. And include your email just in case I don't have a chance to answer your question, and I'll get back to you later. I also want to encourage pushback. So this is possibly some new content. And so I want to hear your feedback along the way as well. All right, so getting into it, talking about feature debt, the unconventional sibling of tech debt. I'm assuming we're good still so far? Technically, it's just hard to see.
Looks great.
All right, so many of us are probably scared of having too much tech debt. For those of you who are not familiar with tech debt, we'll talk about it in the beginning of this presentation, but for those of you who are familiar with it, we're probably scared that we're going to amass too much tech debt and our teams will stop being able to deliver. But I think a less commonly discussed, but just as powerful issue also exists, which is called feature debt, which is obviously the topic of our presentation today. So 2 things to keep in mind as we're going through this. One, it's very different by organization. The number of features that will create feature debt will differ by every organization based on their resources, their size, the velocity, their system architecture, their ability to release, all of those kinds of things. But no one is immune to building too much. And also can affect companies at every stage. And as we go, I'll kind of talk about the impact of each of these items kind of by stage of company. And then one other thing is what we're calling a feature for the purpose of this discussion is anything both big and small that is new or separate capability or functionality. All right, so what we're going to talk about today, first, we're going to talk about what is feature debt. Then we're going to talk about how you amass feature debt, the impact of feature debt, and then ultimately, of course, how not to fall into this trap, how to keep yourself away from feature debt. But first, I think it's important to talk about, so what is feature debt? I think it's important to first talk about debt, because that's where all of this comes from. So debt is the state of being under obligation to pay or repay someone or something in return for something received. It's a state of owing. So think of it as a state of owing. One thing I want to point out is that debt often has compounding interest. So compounding interest is basically interest on top of interest. So if you borrow $100 this year and at a 10% interest rate, you owe $110 next year. The following year, that interest rate is calculated on the $110. So basically, debt gets more expensive the longer you wait to pay it back. So with that principle, about 30 years ago, the concept of tech debt came about. So tech debt is the cost of additional work caused by choosing an easy and fast solution now, instead of building a better approach that would take longer. So for those of you who are building products, you've experienced this, right? Like we're constantly making trade-offs and decisions on timing and scope and also approach. We could get something out, it could work, but it's not built the best way that we want it to be done. And we're making those trade-offs hopefully consciously. But then that builds what's called tech debt. So the concept of feature debt is not too different. So feature debt is the accrued cost of constantly adding new functionality into your product or system instead of building better, more complete solutions. We'll obviously talk about this in a lot more detail, but that's the overall definition. And one thing that I wanted to share is that feature debt contributes to all other kind of debt in software development. So we talked about tech debt. There's things like UI debt, right? Your user interface. You will have made decisions years ago about certain UI paradigms or best practices that you're using and continue to build on those over years, but they start to get outdated. They start to be ineffective. That's another kind of debt, and feature debt contributes to that even more. All right. So that is what feature debt is. And we'll just start talking about how you amass feature debt. Okay. So in the early days, it's often by building too many integrated MVPs. So MVPs, or minimally viable products, are a great tool. I would never suggest not using minimally viable products. They're great when so much is unknown, to test new ideas, to learn fast, learn cheap, keep moving forward, keep your learning going. But when these MVPs are combined and built on top of each other, you can start to amass feature debt. You continue to test different items without kind of wrapping up or completing your other experiment using MVPs. So again, the opportunity for you is MVPs are great, too many at the same time, not great. Then over time, it becomes improper prioritization, right? So we, again, those in the product community are very aware of, we have to prioritize the work that we're gonna do moving forward to achieve our goals. Over time, we might improperly prioritize. So we're moving on to a new problem before that which already exists is working to solve the customer's problem, right? So we've got something up, it's doing okay, it's not yet fully kind of solving the problem as we had hoped, but we got to move on and build the next feature. And so as you're making these prioritization decisions, you need to be thinking about, are things worth the capacity that they will inevitably cause in the future? So oftentimes we consider the effort to build our MVP, or the effort to build phase 1, or phase 1 and phase 2. We think about this, but we don't think about the cost that it will exist to maintain that feature over the course of its history. And if sometimes you'll say, hey, we just need to release this, then we're good, we're not gonna work on it anymore, we just need to have it, then it begs the question of, is it really worth building to begin with? And that's not for me to decide, but that is something you need to consider of, like, if we don't plan on improving this anymore, is it worth having? And so as you're making these prioritization decisions, again, are you balancing the existing functionality with new functionality properly? And again, this is different by organization. It really depends on capacity constraints and trade-offs. But again, this can affect every organization. And so the other area I've seen this coming from is ultimately it's poor leadership and poor vision, right? So if your leadership doesn't have a great vision of what your product is supposed to achieve, then they'll likely just keep throwing out ideas or throwing darts to the teams and say, hey, build this, we need this, without fully understanding what it's trying to accomplish. So I've seen this where, someone will see something that another product has, and they'll say, we need that, right? Like product A does feature X, so we should do feature X too, right? It's pretty straightforward. Like, it's readily apparent, they love it somewhere, they see it all the time, and they're like, we should be doing that too. But the thing to consider is that feature X is solving a very specific problem for product A's users, right? It might not be the same problem that you have. Also, the company that builds product A might have the resources or the capacity or the ability to deliver different than your company. And so you can't just say, because one group is doing it, that we should be able to do it too. So I think a lot of this is really well summarized in the Inspired book by Marty Kagan. And if you haven't read it or aren't aware of it yet, I highly recommend it. I think it's an amazing book for product professionals. And what they talk about is being outcome-based, right? So like, what are we trying to achieve? And seeing features or capabilities as just a means to that end. The end is not the amount of features that you have. And if you find yourself with a leadership or a group that feels that the more features that you have, the better your product is, then you're just kind of a feature factory and you're not really working to achieve outcomes. All right, so that is how we generally amass feature debt. I'm going to pause there for a second. I don't see any questions in the Q&A section, which is okay. But is there anything that I'm missing? Kylie, anyone, any questions that have come up in chat yet? It's really hard.
You're doing great.
Apologize. We can keep rolling. Okay. All right. So now we'll talk about the impact of feature debt. And this is, these are the things that we really need to be looking out for. Give me 1 second to make, okay. Okay, so the impact of feature debt. So first, you could be building the wrong thing. This is typically more for earlier stage companies that are still trying to figure out what their product should be, but this again could impact everyone. So maybe you end up building a SaaS platform when the right solution was a physical hardware product, right? Theoretically, your first MVP was supposed to help you in understanding those decisions. But because every decision that you make creates interdependencies, and then every interdependency hardens the platform from which all other decisions are made, you could just end up building a larger version of the wrong thing. So if your first MVP was a SaaS platform, and then you were learning there, but you kept adding more features on top of it, you know, you're left with a SaaS platform. Whether that was the right path to go down, you never really gave yourself the opportunity to learn from that. So you might build the wrong thing. Let's say you don't. Let's say you build the right thing. But now maybe your architecture is wrong and overly complex because it was built to support a lot of individual wrong things. Right? So like, hey, we need to be able to do X, Y, Z, or X and Y and Z and A and B and C. When at the end, you really only have to do 2 of those things, but now your system and your infrastructure was built to support logic for everything. Earlier today, I was listening to a talk from Ted Novak on basically why you don't need a new website. And he hit on this as well, right? Customers come to them and wanting to build a new website. And when they do, they think of all these things they're going to need years in the future. And he says, hey, let's just build what we need now. Let's not overcomplicate the system. And we can build those things when we know that we need to. It really helps you kind of make real in-time decisions. All right. So that's the worst thing. You could build the wrong thing. What also can happen is that no or almost no of your individual features work that well. So when you launch, your features or your product is incomplete and it doesn't fully solve the problem or fit into your overall experience because you wanted to get something out. This is great. This is what we teach. This is what we learn. This is, hey, we need to get things out so we can start learning as fast as humanly possible. If we didn't, we've released too late, right? Like if you wait for it to be perfect, then you're going to release too late. You're never going to get anything out. The problem becomes you release with a list of things you know you need to fix, and you're going to get an even longer list once you release and you learn from customers the improvements that you need to make. But what then happens is all of these items, this whole list just basically goes into your backlog, and inevitably you're going to have conversations around, oh, those are nice to have, those are nice to have, because they're competing with so many other things, right? You don't have the resources to work off that list. Now your list is combined with several other lists. And then likely also because of the way you've been doing things, you're likely moving on to the next feature where this feature or most of your features or capabilities have more to do. They have more room to improve. Also, prioritization becomes more difficult. So in general, the more things that you have, the more complexity in your system, the harder it is to make decisions, to work, and to kind of compare between all of those. So your backlog is going to be filled with missing functionality from this, future enhancements that you know you wanted to make, bugs that you find, and that's going to be the case for every one of your features, as well as items to add more features, right? So how do you decide what to work on? Do you work on the feature that's showing promise and meeting 70% of its desired outcomes, or the one that needs the most help and is only meeting 40% of its outcomes? You know, I can't answer that, but this is just an example of a question that you're going to constantly be faced with. And there's going to be many different questions. Again, the more complex not only your product gets, but then your backlog gets, and harder to make decisions. So generally, when you're prioritizing, you're doing a cost benefit analysis, right? You're seeing how much benefit your customers will get from something compared to how much it's going to cost you. Generally, you want high benefit, really high value items that are really easy. That's ideal. The problem is, like, so many of these things are unknown for new features, right? Like, or any new capability. The problem might still be a little fuzzy. You don't know exactly what usage is going to look like. You don't know exactly what kind of value your customers are going to derive. You don't know how much value your company is going to derive from it. And you really have no idea how much it's going to cost to get built. So, you know, you are constantly having difficult decisions and trade-offs while prioritizing. All right. Then what also happens is you spend a lot of money and resources, right? The way I like to summarize this is, if you release it, you own it. So once it's out there, you own it. You own ongoing maintenance. You own more complicated release testing, because now when you make a change somewhere else, this functionality still has to be tested. You own the integration with other features, the expanded architecture, internal training, customer training, documentation, like whatever you can think of now has to include this functionality. And so there's just a lot more costs along the way. So at this point, it should be relatively obvious. You're going to experience customer churn, right? Like, if theoretically almost none of your features work well and that constantly is happening, customers perceive that your product isn't good. And it's still kind of not solving their problem, right? Like, it's getting there, or it has pieces of it, but it's not really doing it. And so they're going to leave for an alternative that actually works. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. What will also happen is your employees will leave. So all of this complexity, all of these inability to release will frustrate your employees with slow development cycles. Those who own features that are constantly deprioritized yet suboptimal will be frustrated. Everyone knows you have unhappy customers, and customers might be leaving. And so your employees don't want to necessarily be in an environment like that. I promise I've seen this happen for sure. And it's just really difficult when all of these complexities lead to people not being satisfied in what they're able to deliver. All right, so that's the impact of feature debt. I will pause once again before moving on to how to not fall into this trap, to see if we have any thoughts or questions. All right, brave soul. How can you already tell if you have too much feature debt, and what do you do if you do have too much feature debt? So the first part of the question I can answer. The second part is actually our next section. So that's a great question. I would say, I think my goal in basically the impact of feature debt is, these are the warning signs. Like, look at, if you're seeing these things happening, then you know that you might have an issue with feature debt. It's not like you can look into your bank account and see like a negative value, but if you have a strong feeling that your solution isn't the right thing, few of your features are working as designed, or basic functionality isn't working as you would expect, or as your customers would expect. You're seeing churn, your prioritization process is really difficult. Like, these are all signs, like everything that we've just talked about are signs that you have too many features. And then we'll talk about kind of how to get out of that situation. Yeah, but great question. And I think, like, personally, when I experienced this, it was obvious when we just kept getting told what to build, and it kept being net new functionality, right? Like, that was a sign to me that, like, we weren't paying attention to what we already had. We kept focusing on new things. But let's take that as a segue into, how do you not fall into this trap? What do you do if you have the situation? So first, what I'll say is basically these are going to range from like how to stop it from happening at all to we have it, okay, let's deal with it, right? It's going to happen. It's going to happen to the best of us. What can we do about it, or how can we avoid it going forward? All right, so first is to focus and say no, right? Like anyone who talks to you about product or being a product manager is going to talk about saying no. That is one great way we have to make sure that we're focused on the right things and not building too much. So to do this, focus on your customer's biggest pain and define outcomes that you hope to achieve to solve that pain. And then use features to do that. Again, the Inspired book by Marty Kagan is a great kind of description of how this goes, but really, what is your customer's biggest problem? And until you're really solving that problem, do your best to not move on. And if the goal of a new feature is to solve that problem, make sure that line is clearly delineated and expressed and tested so that you can determine, hey, this thing isn't really solving that problem. So you're going to use everything in a product manager's toolbox. You're going to use trade-offs. You're going to use data, basically everything that product managers do to help say no and work with other teams to really focus. The one thing I'll caveat here is it's sometimes hard to know the trade-offs for new features. As I mentioned, almost everything about a new feature is unknown. And so it's really difficult to have a direct conversation around, improving an existing feature versus the opportunity of a new feature, because while you might try to put numbers to each of them and think that you're comparing apples to apples, you're really not. So I'll give a quick story. A startup I worked at, I joined kind of in the process, and they had a feature ready to go. It was a great feature. It was really important. It was something that other similar products had, but when I got there, I realized like it was not addressing the main customer pain, and the main customer pain was far from being solved. And so we had something that was code complete, ready to ship, just had to do a little more testing and it was good to go. And I had to work with members of the engineering team, the UX user experience team, leadership to say like, look, this is one of the worst things as a product manager I could do is basically take something that is ready. There's no new costs to launch this thing and stop it from launching. And the reason I did it and the reason we all agreed on it was because there were so many other costs implied once it was released that the actual development of the initial functionality was not the biggest cost. All right, so you don't say no or you can't say no. Then the next option is to wait. So wait to add new features until existing features are more stable and mature. So bear with me on this analogy, but I want to say that features are like children. The more that you have, the more you have to manage. So two parents can typically manage multiple children because those children are usually in different stages of life. The older children are a little more self-sufficient. They don't need kind of like minute by minute watching and hovering. And so then you can watch kind of like the new children. So I would just caution to add more infants or new features to the same amount of parents, your existing capacity will become too hard to manage. Now, there are parents out there who have twins and triplets or children of similar ages, and my hat's off to them. It is just really difficult. And so you just need to know that that's going to be really difficult to manage. So all I'll say is just wait until your kid is out of diapers before you have another one. Again, to continue the product feature analogy. And I am a parent, so I don't have kids too close in age, and I can't imagine it. All right. So this next one, consider removing functionality. So this thing got built, for whatever reason, it exists. It's possible to remove it. It happens. Companies do it. It's not the best answer. You really have to consider the impact to your customer experience. You really have to execute it with thought and caution. There might be some customers out there who really, really love it and will get really upset if it gets taken away from them. For people, losses loom larger than gains. So if they didn't have it ever to begin with, they'd be okay. But once they have it and you take it away from them, they're going to be irate. And so you really need to be careful when considering this. And then I'd also consider kind of long-term impact. So if your company is constantly doing this or with any kind of regularity, you could start to lose trust in your company or in your product from your customers. But you can potentially remove it. So basically, sell that extra car, sell your boat, get rid of it so it's off of your books and you're no longer kind of paying debt for it. All right, so let's say like you're going to move forward with an idea or a new solution. I want you to think of the ability to undo them, right? So when we think about how we build, I want you to think about reversible versus irreversible decisions. So you want to make irreversible decisions when you have a high amount of confidence, and reversible decisions when you have lower amounts of confidence. There are ways to make reversible decisions in your product, in your ability to build MVPs and test things. And so just know that that's an option as you're going forward and deciding kind of what to create. Again, MVPs are great. You need to do that learning. But if you build it all the way through the system and it's perfect, it's going to be harder to undo later. So you could create a landing page, right? Like if maybe you have a website or some way of testing through a landing page, it's just one page. There's no functionality integrated with all the complexities of your product. Worst case, you just take that page down. You haven't necessarily lost anything. If you're familiar with what they call Wizard of Oz experiments, a Wizard of Oz experiments, just like the Wizard of Oz, is basically a customer does something, they think the whole system is automated, but in reality, none of the piping exists. You are doing everything in the back end manually. So that feature exists, but none of the plumbing had to be built to interact with all of the other capabilities that you have. So that complexity is at least taken away. So if you removed this functionality, everything else would move forward smoothly because no changes were made. And then you could also consider not providing this new capability to your entire population, right? Use some levels of A/B testing, give it to a small population group. So worst case scenario, only a small amount of customers are impacted potentially. All right, we have a question, so I'm just gonna read it. Removing functionality, is this something you have done? And if so, can you tell us about the experience? So great question, really putting me to task. I have not, but in researching all of this, like I am aware that companies like Google have built things and then gotten rid of them. And that's kind of where the impact to your customer base are, because Google has so much scale, they try to leverage that for their product ecosystem. But then when a user buys into it, and that's a great solution for them, and they include everything in that whole ecosystem, and then that piece gets taken away, Google took some flack for that, the example that I'm thinking of. And so that's why you have to be really cautious on how you do it. But no, I haven't done it before. I wish I had some experience in it. All right. And then the last piece is like, you have feature debt. To the question earlier, you have it, what do you do? It's just like any other debt, right? Like going back to the very beginning, you have to pay it down. It gets more expensive over time. And so if you have it and you know that you have it, you have to invest in paying it down. Add resources to engineering or DevOps or architecture or customer success to meet your company where it is, right? If you have too much feature debt and you're like, hey, we got to clear this out, spend time to invest in it. And what I'll say to this point is debt isn't a bad thing. Like we use debt strategically. People use debt to go through college. People use debt to start businesses. This is what all Startup Week is about, right? Like we're trying to create something new, but we know that we're costing ourselves in the future to get some gains now. And so find a time so that you can start paying down this debt. The question is like, how do you know if you have too much of it? And then what do you do? I'd say if you find yourself, if you realize, hey, we're in a situation where we have feature debt, work with your leadership, work on the product vision to talk about, is now the right time? Are we in a good enough place with our product where we can actually start putting resources towards feature debt? Probably when you're doing your product prioritization, you're allocating some amount of resources to tech debt, right? Like we need to refactor this code, or we need to migrate to new databases. Like you're probably thinking about it that way. And basically it really depends on the percent of your capacity that you're dedicating to debt. So you might need to dedicate more of your capacity to your debt, your feature debt, than you would have done otherwise. And it doesn't mean it's 100% of your capacity, but you can start to increase that amount. So one place I was working on, rule of thumb, is we always wanted to be spending about 20% on tech debt because we had a decent amount of it. It was starting to impact things, but it wasn't the worst thing in the world. You know, you could make that 50-50 or 80-20 the other way. Like you as a team have to decide that. But I think hopefully with these tools, you know, you'll have the ability to recognize when you're in that situation and say, hey, it's time to start paying this down. I think we need to invest more in our debt because otherwise we're just going to have even higher expenses in the future. And so those are all the ways, again, from keeping it from happening ever to paying it down when you do have it. And I'll just end by saying, like, many great companies have many great products with many great features. Like there is not a rule that says like, if you have 5 things, that's too much. I just want you to be aware that like those companies who are doing it well have the ability, have the resources to have that much. Like if you don't have like a well set up automation testing and CI/CD pipeline and all of these ways of delivering effectively, then your testing is large and it's manual. And that just means that you're more affected by additional features than another company might be. So there's companies that are doing great things with so much functionality, but again, they have the infrastructure to support that. So perfect timing. I would say questions, but I also want thoughts, right? Like if there's real pushback or kind of thoughts on this, I want to hear from that too. So the question right now is, will this recording be available? So I think the answer is yes, everything will be available in a couple of weeks, but I'll let the Startup Week team.
Yes, everything will be available, and it is live streaming on YouTube as well.
Awesome. Any other thoughts or questions? I'm only looking at the Q&A section, so if there's anything in chat, can you just read it, or I can't see it?
You are good on the chat, David.
All right. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. Okay. Yeah, any other thoughts or questions along the way? I can always go back to something. Okay, the name of the book I recommended, so it's called Inspired: How to Create Great Tech Products Customers Love by Marty Kagan. And then Marty's got like a whole company and they have a blog, and to be honest, it's one of my go-to resources for almost anything product. And since we have the time, I'll wait for more Q&A, but one of the biggest theses of the book and of their group is basically this concept of outcome-based. Like everything should be trying to achieve an outcome, and that's its entire goal. So oftentimes and I've experienced this and I've done it myself, we release features because we think features are the goal or functionality is the goal, but ultimately you're trying to achieve something with your customers and they're trying to accomplish something themselves. And so framing it that way, setting up your metrics that way will help tremendously, basically for everything that you do. All right, so yeah, again, I love this topic. I hope it was helpful and informative. You know, feel free to reach out with any other questions or thoughts after the session, because I really do, I'm really interested in this whole concept and kind of just the overall process we use to to build great products. So I appreciate being part of this.
And David, sorry to interrupt you. You actually had a few more questions come in through the Q&A portal.
Scrolling. There you go. Okay. Any other book suggestions? That's I was actually talking to someone recently. It's tough to find like the right books based on what you've got. So I actually recently listened to Competing Against Luck by Clayton Christensen. Essentially, it's a book on the jobs to be done methodology, which I think is really important for product people to understand kind of the job that your customer is trying to accomplish. The idea is they don't hire your product to have your product, they hire it to accomplish a job in a certain circumstance. And it's a great framing. And so that book is a wonderful one. How have you addressed stakeholders that don't get technical debt and push for more features to gain sales? Yeah. So basically, this is a huge part of alignment on product vision, product execution, and a lot of this, it's something that almost everyone struggles with. One, it's trying to get everyone aligned to an overall vision of not only what the product will do, but how we plan to build the product. And so when I've come to new places, I've set that in the beginning and say, hey, look, we're always going to be working on technical debt of some kind. It'll vary, it'll wax and wane, but that's always going to be part of it. And if we don't, and I try to use examples of companies that don't and then can't function going forward. If you have any allies in the company who have seen that firsthand, that's always helpful. And the analogy I used was we're going to keep building this train and driving this train as fast as we can, but we also have to build the track. And so getting them to understand that and then expressing to them kind of the real impact to things is really important. And it's really hard because, sometimes I work with engineering and they say, hey, the product could not work one day and you never know when that's going to happen. Right. So how are we planning for that? And you just have to kind of understand the likelihood of that happening, the impact of that happening, and kind of the cost of it happening to try to make those decisions. But I agree. I think allocating a percentage to any kind of debt in a product system is really hard if you don't have alignment at the top from everyone. The next question is, do you have suggestions on concrete ways to sell upper management on the importance of tackling tech debt or feature debt? My management will respond well to a message like, we're spending X amount on this. Yeah, and that was, I think, so again, I'll go back to a lot of the impact, right? You can talk about the impact that you're having on delivery, on customer satisfaction. One example I had in my own experience was, again, core functionality was not working. Things that sound simple just weren't working. And so you have to make that very apparent and say, we could build this other thing, but we think right now, again, to address the outcome that we're trying to achieve, the customer pain point specifically, we should be working on this. And again, if you don't agree at this level, if you don't agree on the outcomes or the KPIs or the metrics or whatever or OKRs, whatever you're using, if you don't agree on that, you're never going to agree on what we should be working on this sprint. But if we all agree on the main customer pain point is X, and then you can point out how the new feature does not address and is not intended to address X, then it goes back to okay, let's bring it back. Is our priority wrong? Are our OKRs wrong? Maybe that's the case. Maybe we need to win this new customer and that would save our business. That's fine. But you have to bring it back to, these are the goals we're trying to achieve, and keep reminding them of those goals. Hopefully that answered that question. And then again, we kind of talked about it here, but you have a list of all the different costs associated with tech debt. And if you can find that data, then you're well armed with, hey, 100% of our customers are going to this basic functionality. 50% of them are getting what they want. We need to address that before we address something that is unknown and not intended to solve our biggest objective. Any strategies for managing scope to get something out the door quickly to learn from In other words, sort of coming back and getting those follow-ups prioritized. So this might be two questions. One, it's about properly scoping an MVP. And then the other question is then getting alignment on fixing the items that were left out of the MVP. So I'll try to address the second one first. The second one is always tough. Personally, I think, again, this is based on learning from a lot of others, so I can't take credit, but you have your initial list of things that didn't make it in the MVP, but you really think matter. And I'm actually experiencing this right now at my current role. We have a list of things that were considered part of phase 2. But the intention of the MVP was to learn from your customers. So your original definition of phase 2, or your original list of follow-up features or follow-up capabilities or improvements to tackle this feature should be reconsidered based on what you're learning. Like the whole goal of the MVP was to learn, so let yourself learn first. And then, I'm sorry, part of the question was, how do we then follow up and get those things done? Then it goes back to all the mechanisms that your team are using to prioritize. So, sorry, I'm just trying to think. So how are you guys, what kind of measures are you using? What kind of value metrics and cost metrics are you using? Make sure you continue to consider those when looking at your follow-up items. And again, looking for customer feedback along the way to say, hey, this assumption we had about number 2 on the list has been validated. We're seeing that come back from our beta customers. Let's spend some time on that versus, hey, item 3 from the list, no one has said anything about it yet. We're not really getting anyone from even sales saying anything about it. Maybe it wasn't as important as we thought, 6 months ago, maybe when we started scoping this thing out and planning it. The first part of your question, how do you best define an MVP? That could be a whole topic on its own. I don't want to try to really be an expert on that. There are techniques, customer journey mapping, things like that you can use to map out a journey and define like critical path items. But you also have to work with your team on what the purpose of the MVP is. So sometimes the concept of minimally viable product is often really used as the minimal sellable product. So your sales team will say, like, I can't sell what you've scoped as an MVP. And you'll return and say, I never meant for you to sell it. Like, I meant to learn from this to figure out what we need to build so that you can sell it hopefully soon. And so when you're scoping your MVP, you need to get really good alignment from all of the teams about how the MVP is going to be used. Because again, current experience, we're launched an MVP, we're getting learnings back, it's doing a great job there, but our sales team is saying, like, I can't go wide with this, I can't show this to like our customer. And you're like, well, this isn't supposed to be like this great thing to demo, like we're trying to learn from this thing that we've built. So alignment there is going to be really important as you define your MVP as well. Oh, great. We had another question. Do you use or recommend any product analytics tools like Pendo or Amplitude? So I don't have tremendous experience with those. I have used Full Story in the past. That's been helpful for not only kind of tracking overall metrics, but also being able to see customers essentially using your product after the fact. So when you see a customer doesn't accomplish their objective, you can see click by click how they got through your experience and start to identify kind of bottlenecks or issues in your experience. So that's my best answer. Sorry. Okay, it looks like those are all the questions in Q&A. I'm really grateful that we had so many. Always happy to answer more. Hope this was helpful. I don't know, Kylie, is there anything you want me to do next?
No, David, want to thank you. This was an awesome presentation. I know I learned a ton, and I just also want to thank everyone who attended. Thanks for your participation and engagement. This was a really good session. So I hope that everyone has a great rest of your Tuesday. And like David mentioned, this will be recorded and available if you want to share it with other folks in your network at a later date. So David and everybody, thank you from Denver Startup Week, and we'll see you guys all soon.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.